This is Bryan Alexander. Should I be starting off directly myself, or should I get a
no,
intro?
that's okay. I'll go ahead and introduce you.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the conference. I am very pleased to introduce to you our special keynote. Bryan Alexander is a world-renowned education futurist. A prolific speaker and consultant, Bryan publishes books, chapters, and articles. He created the Future of Education Observatory, which you can find online at futureofeducation.us, including the monthly FTTE Trends Analysis, an online book club, and a weekly video conference discussion. He has been teaching and exploring virtual worlds since the early 1990s. Bryan welcomes your comments and questions during the presentation. Please help me give Bryan Alexander a warm VWBPE welcome. Bryan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here for all kinds of reasons. So before I begin, just quick show on the chat box. Can you hear me all right? Excellent. No, see, if I saw the applause, that could have been anything. That could have been, applause for silence. It depends. Well, thank you very much for letting me come here. Before I begin, I would like to just thank several people for their excellent support. I'd like to thank iSky Silverweb and especially Olive Tree Lighthouse for their kind, generous, patient, thoughtful help in getting me onto the stage with you. They're terrific people, especially Olive Tree. I'm deeply in their debt. Thank you. Second, as a personal note, I've participated in virtual worlds since the 1990s. Yes, I'm one of those old school mud and moo people. I taught classes in active worlds in the 1990s back in the day, so I was naturally an active Second Life participant more than a decade ago from your early days. I explored a great deal. I helped many academics and institutions get in-world, held events, gave talks, and wrote about Second Life in many venues, including my first book. So I'm really, really delighted to be here today. Now, professionally, I'm a futurist. And that means that I get to juggle slides, which apparently I'm placing all over the place. Oh dear, all the wrong slides. Oh my gosh, rogue slides is really the case. Well, being a futurist means I get to break technology wherever I go, which is a lot of fun. There are a lot of ways to show how technology works and how it doesn't work, as well as ways to show how people misuse or abuse technology. Now, as a futurist, this means that I help people think more creatively and strategically about the future. And my particular specialty is the future of education and technology, which means that I work with colleges, universities, libraries, governments, businesses, associations, and nonprofits worldwide. I help them better anticipate what might come next for their sector. You can see, therefore, why I was and remain interested in virtual worlds. Now, today I'd like to speak about the future and some roles I see for virtual worlds. In particular, I'd like to argue that virtual worlds are benevolent agents in helping everyone deal with some huge developments and challenges, both within education and the broader world. Now, there's a lot to cover, there's a lot to talk about, and I would like to make sure that I hear from you as we go. So as you have questions or comments, please put them into the chat box. I would love to be able to hear from you and to understand where we might be going. And if you have any objections, if you have any evidence or examples, if you have any howls of outrage or dismay, please type them in the chat. It would be great to hear from you. Now, there's a lot to cover. So if you can see this one slide that I've managed to cram into the interface, in my work, I maintain a project called the Future of Education Observatory. and it has a lot of different pieces. This one piece that you're seeing here is a chart of about 86 trends that we track for education and technology. You can see they're clumped under a few major headers. So one of those headers is the world of education in context. So those are all the fields that impinge on education, be they demographics, economics, policy, social development, culture, and so on. On the right side, you can see a stack of technologies. So we track technologies very, very carefully. And that ranges from Internet of Things to mobile devices to gaming to digital video to augmented reality, virtual reality, and blockchain, and so on. In between, you can see a synthesis where we have technology and education combined. So in some cases, those are commodity uses of technology. In some cases, those are the development of new technologies just for education, like the learning management system. And we combine all these trends, and we have what some call the higher education crisis, or what I've referred to as peak higher education. So that's an awful lot to cover in one spot. If you would like to learn more, go to futureofeducation.us, and you can see more about this. This report here is called the FTTE report. You can see also I do a weekly video conference with about 200 people called the Future Trends Forum. We also blog pretty religiously, so you can follow that. We do a regular book club that's entirely online, where we look at books with the future of education and technology, and those books range from education books to economics to near future science fiction. We have more coming still. So again, if you want to learn more, you can find out about that. Now, that's too much to cover in just a few minutes, so I'm going to pull out some of the major details. And again, if during question and answer, if you'd like us to turn to other trends, or if you want to amplify one of these points, please let us know, and we can do that. We're very flexible. First, right now, we're experiencing a revolution in human-computer interfaces and in hardware and digital content. And the beginning of all this is virtual reality. Now, virtual reality is an old technology. The term is clunky, dates back to the early 1990s. And we had a virtual reality boom and bust right then. In fact, one of the most prominent critics of the digital world, Jaron Lanier, was originally a VR proponent. And I like to think part of his bitterness has to do with his VR dream not coming true when he wanted it to. But virtual reality is the idea of creating a whole virtual world, like this one right here. We all know about that. It's now coming to pass in part with the infusion of a lot of money, but also the development of some pretty good hardware. So we've seen tools developed and released from a variety of companies. Now, the flip side of VR is augmented reality. In augmented reality, we take this and turn it inside out. We are able to, instead of creating a virtual world, we take the digital world or digital content and cue it to the physical environment so that we can walk with it, so that the physical world can be inhabited and enhanced by the virtual world. You can see this in a light form with tools like Google Maps or Yelp. You can see it in more detailed forms when, say, you add visual content to a cell phone when you point your phone at something. Now, augmented reality and virtual reality are two sides of the same coin. It's possible that we can turn that coin to active currency with what some call mixed reality. So that is, when you put something on your eyes, a visor, contact lenses, a headset, or just put your phone in front of your face, then you look at the world and you're able to see a mix of the physical world around you along with the virtual world. So, for example, Magic Leap argues that they should be able to provide the ability to see magical creatures walk across your living room. Microsoft is a little more prosaic. They are happy to support having you in your room with, say, Pandora pasted to the wall, Internet Explorer on the ceiling, and a spreadsheet on the desk in front of you. So you can smoothly move back and forth between the real world and the virtual world, the physical world and the digital. Now, this combination of mixed reality is pretty enormous. This is arguably the biggest change in the computing paradigm since the 1960s, when Doug Engelbart gave us the mouse, Windows, keyboard interface. So that's something to watch for very carefully. But also recall that these changes are made possible by mobile devices. I mean, you recall the mobile device revolution has revolutionized the world and reshaped societies all around the planet. In fact, we have more people who get online through handheld devices than through any other mechanism. And in fact, if you're in the US or in Europe and you take a look at a web page, the web pages now look different than they used to. That is, they're smaller, simpler, have fewer columns. The reason being that they expect the leading viewers or users to be experiencing them through a cell phone or through a tablet. So if you're looking through a desktop or a laptop, you're no longer the leading audience. In fact, you're a secondary audience. I mean, the mobile revolution just goes further and further, and we can talk about this if you like, but mobile plays a key role in connecting with VR, AR, and mixed reality. The second major trend cluster that I want to mention involves automation. And here I want you to think about the whole gamut of automation, including robotics, artificial intelligence in its various forms, such as deep learning and neural networks, and the more advanced combinations of algorithms with big data. We're now living through a gradual realization of many old futures as software gets more powerful, robots become more capable, and we create new information out of plentiful data. We've already seen automation play key roles in diverse fields. So, for example, self-driving cars were once the pure stuff of legend or fantasy. And now they're already changing our economy and our physical environment. Indeed, a Los Angeles architectural firm had a contest. They were trying to figure out what would happen to roads and road spaces after self-driving cars really took off. That is, if we have fewer cars on the road because we don't need to be driving them as often, what's going to happen to multi-lane highways? What's going to happen to big parking lots or parking structures? So that's one way in which automation is already beginning to happen, not to mention what might happen to, say, the Teamsters Union in the United States for truck drivers. We're also seeing robots used in war, everything from drones to hardened robots that advance into a battlefield or try and take out mines. We're seeing robots widely used around the world in industry. In the United States, the geographical region that uses more robots than anybody else is the Midwest, because we have so many factories producing stuff. In fact, we now have the phenomenon of dark factories. That is, factories that work without any lights at all because there aren't any humans involved, and the robots use other senses. We're also seeing robots in industry and in some other strange ways, namely finance. So, for example, the old economics of buying low and selling high is something that you can code very simply. Wall Street for years now has been running software that does a lot of their trading between hedge funds, for example. That's already shaped the economy. So if you don't think that robots matter, if you don't get involved with automation yourself, it's already been involved with you in changing the economy in which you inhabit. There used to be the idea that robots and automation were inhuman, impractical, or better yet, uncreative. But we're already seeing robots and automation being used to create stuff. That is, we've seen robots being used to generate place names and screens and screenplays, rather. We've also seen robots being used to produce journalism in meteorology, weather reports, in finance, and in sports. In fact, we're seeing a subgenre of automation used to create fiction and to create new art. So already we're seeing automation really, really take off in advance. Now, the possibilities of where automation could go very, very widely. Some argue that this is just the beginning of a revolution as profound as the Industrial Revolution. Others caution that automation can become tyrannical, subtly yet brutally reinforcing power and inequalities. Cathy O'Neil, for example, has the best titled book of the 21st century, Weapons of Math Destruction. She makes a powerful case for how, not necessarily for reasons of malice, that people can use big data, data analytics, and algorithms to reinforce prejudice, bias, and inequality. Now, some economists and futurists say there are three other ways forward, involving underemployment, cyborgs, and brave new careers. So, for example, it's possible that automation will replace many human functions and jobs. So you think about, say, for example, replacing taxi drivers or truck drivers or short order cooks and so on. And this could lead to widespread anxiety, underemployment, and unemployment. Now, it's also possible that we may end up rethinking many human functions and jobs as a synthesis of human and machine, where we work much more closely together in order to maximize our respective strengths of carbon and silicon. So you can think of that as a kind of cyborg arrangement where we're always talking to our portable AI tutor, or always following our assistant, or constantly running data analyses. Now, another possible future We might create, well, invent new post-human, post-AI functions and jobs. Imagine titles like AI ethicist, for example, or human creativity engineer. Now, whichever one of these paths we follow, cyborgs or tyranny or reinvention, each of us leaves us with a profoundly changed world. Now, we can go even further. We can introduce gaming into the mix. Gaming, that enormous, international, hugely influential industry, is already playing a role in VR, AR, and mixed reality, primarily by providing content. It's possible that successful VR, AR, MR games could drive those technologies' adoption. I think, for example, the meteoric success of Pokemon Go, which suddenly brought AR home, literally, to millions and millions of people. Now, automation can combine with gaming to produce deeper and greater simulations, human-computer interaction, digital environments. AI has already played a role in games for a generation, training players in the ways of interacting with non-human intelligence. Imagine how much farther this could go as we develop and multiply more automation throughout our civilization. As I like to say, we can't understand the 21st century without reading science fiction. I'm saying this to an audience that knows all about Snow Crash and True Names, right? I hope so. Now, if we turn to education, we can see how education faces a growing range of possibilities through these technologies for content presentation, student engagement, storytelling, and access. We're just starting to explore, for example, VR, AR, and mixed reality content creation and consumption for academia. If you're curious about this, the world leader is the Digital Bodies outfit with Emery Craig and Maya Gorgievna, and they've done tremendous work, and I really strongly recommend taking a look at them. Go to digitalbodies.net. You can find more. For that world, we're maybe at the stage of the web around 1996. We don't have good editors for producing VR, AR content for the average user. Now, meanwhile, we're developing intelligent agents and the strategic use of big data to help students succeed. And we have several projects that connect AI with scholarly research. For example, IBM deployed Watson on medical records in order to try and get scholars to get a sense of where research could go. The Chan Zuckerberg Foundation purchased a Toronto company called Meta, which is all about helping scholars find connections between scholarly research. What I'm waiting for is to see the first co-authored article, scholarly article, which has an AI listed as a co-author. Now, meanwhile, gaming has become a growth industry in many universities, with students fascinated with gaming and trying to figure out a way to get into the game industry professionally. And game studies has become a field stretching from classrooms to research and libraries. Now, I want to shift and talk about a different trend set, but let me just pause for a second. I just gone through a couple of huge technologies. Let me ask you in the audience, are there other technologies that you would really want to bring up right now? Or do you want me to go back to any of these technologies, automation or mobile or AR mixed reality, and focus on those a bit more? Letty Luckstone, thank you for sharing that URL. I appreciate that. Buffy Beal asked about mixed reality. So let me just how it will impact you. So think about this in a few different ways. You can think about it as a kind of domestic technology. So imagine being working at home, and you have something on some kind of gear, say lightweight glasses or perhaps a very thin visor, and you're able to move around your house and do things physically. Pick up the phone, wash dishes, pet the cat. But at the same time, you're receiving information. Some of the information is audio, but some of it's visual. So, for example, you might have a video feed of your physical place of work. You're working from home today, but you have the office or campus or wherever available, and you just pasted that above your sofa. So you can always turn to look to that. Now, if I visited, I don't have the gear on my head, I would simply see the sofa. I would see you staring at that space, thinking, what's she staring at? But you'd be able to see that video feed the entire time. Then you'd be able to respond to it with your voice. So you could simply talk as if it's a video feed. Say it's a video conversation, you can go back and forth. But you can also use your voice to sum up different parts of the technology. You could, for example, ask Google or Bing to search for something. You might use your hands instead to interact with different digital objects and move things around. Say, put WordPress over in one corner so you could type out a blog post, or perhaps take Excel and minimize it for right now. I mean, you get to just intertwine the digital and the physical around you, which has all kinds of fascinating implications. I mean, think, for example, about interior design. A completely blank space might actually be very rich since you can populate with digital technology, digital content. Or imagine the outside world, where you could look at the sky and get information about a storm cloud as it approaches you. So we're just beginning to look at this. Now, there's two companies to watch if you're curious. One is Microsoft, who has been doing tremendous work on this. Look at the HoloLens, for example. I think we'd be talking more about it if it weren't such an unsexy company. And the other is a fascinating, mysterious startup called Magic Leap, which is based in Florida. They promise great things. They've taken a lot of money and are waiting to see something to come from that. Let's see, Edith Halderman asks, in such a world, how would K through 12 education be impacted? Oh, that's a great question. I mean, K through 12 is a broad range of 13 years of early development. So we have to figure out at what age which of these technologies would be appropriate. So you could think perhaps using augmented reality for students on a tour and say a planetarium or a museum or a big forest, and have digital content help them through the area. So, say labels in different trees or a guidepost or that kind of thing. We also have to imagine students as makers. Could they make stuff? Could they use mixed reality to then create objects of any kinds, imaginary beasts or guidebooks for themselves? The tricky thing is, it's difficult right now to make the content in most cases. So we have to wait or maybe help develop tools that can actually do that. And then we have to see if they will actually fit the K through 12 environment. That is, will they be appropriate for issues of development? Will they fit curriculum? Will they fit questions of privacy, especially? That's a great question. I would just say one more point about this, not to harsh or mellow on this, but the digital divide is a very, very important force in many countries, especially the United States. And it's possible that the bandwidth demands for VR, which are really extensive, might clobber the networks available to many K through 12 schools. So we'll have to figure out a way to solve that problem. But I would love to hear more, Buffy, of your thoughts. Zinnia Zauber mentions, oh yeah, cootie catchers. What a fantastic thing to do. There's so much playfulness, so much creativity. Now, how do we keep our hands in the creative and research tools? Well, Zinnia, if you just say a little bit more, do you mean because they are owned by companies that might alter them or hide them in ways that we can't see? Or do you mean keeping up with technologies that advance very, very rapidly and quickly? Or is there some other obstacle that you envision? Let me know and I'll respond. Edith Halderman says there'd be a reemergence of Ertmer's first-order barriers, access and bandwidth. Absolutely. Edith, if you go to my site, go to bryanalexander.org, you can find an article I published a few months ago about the digital divide. I didn't cite Ertmer, but I'm definitely talking about access and bandwidth. Xenia, that's a fantastic thing. Xenia asks about touching and engaging more directly. Oh, this is a great point. Imagine all the ways that we can do this. So think, for example, about doing introductory life sciences and getting augmented reality layers over living beings, such as a teacher, so students can see the teacher's insides, right? Peel away the skin, look at the muscle, the bone, and the organs. How much fun would that be? How exciting and shocking. Or being able to do that with other things. So walk through town where a school is, and to be able to add or subtract content. Think historically, being able to see what was in that building spot 100, 200 years ago. So I think you could really, really re-enchant the world through AR and mixed reality. Golden Grey Moon has a different question. I'm wondering if mixed reality should prove to be more productive and sidesteps the problems of human interaction and transportation. It might get to the point of largely replacing real-life interactions. That's definitely been a possibility for every medium humanity has created since print. And by print, I mean writing. That's always, always a possibility. And when our early look at virtual reality shows that it can be, and most of you know this, very, very addictive, very consuming. I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about digital addiction. I think most of which is overblown, but it is possible to sidestep human interaction unless it's mediated interaction. And one of the challenges right now is that a lot of virtual reality based on the headgear is asocial, and it's often isolated. It's an individual and the virtual content. The Facebook is working on making that social. That's part of their goal, so you can interact with people through virtual reality. So hopefully that will be one direction we can head in. And the same is true for augmented reality. I mean, I can imagine, Golden, just walking down the street and looking at inanimate, non-human content, the history of a building or property values. But I could also imagine walking into a place and finding out where everybody is and learning more about people so I can learn more about them and connect with them more carefully. Karen asks a question. Do you see classroom at home children not going to outside places and instead getting the value through this media? Oh, it's quite possible. And in some cases, that would be preferable for some parents. I mean, think about parents or children who are afraid of their environment. They're afraid of school shootings, for example, or they're afraid of climate change. Again, this has been a problem with every medium since writing, where we've been afraid of that virtual substituting for the analog. And every time we've gone through different crises and transformations to shape the medium for that. We thought about this with film, with TV, with radio, with movable type. Now, virtual reality in particular has the additional hook that it seems to be very, very compelling at an emotional level. There's been talk about VR as an empathy engine because your bodily interaction with someone in a virtual environment is so compelling. You begin to feel that you're next to a person. So it's possible that VR may be, as some call it, the ultimate medium, and it may become so powerful that it does attract us. And then we're back in E.M. Forster's world of the machine stops. So that's one possibility that we have to look for. Well, there's a whole bunch of comments that have just strewn out as I've been mattering away. So let me make sure where we are here. Thank you, Buffy. Re-enchanting the world is a great phrase. It's not mine. Literary sweetheart. Oh, I adore you already. Says, recently Amazon has created their Kindle in Motion ebooks that are modeled after the moving picture literature Harry Potter's world. Do you think it's possible they can go further with that? Absolutely, and far further indeed. This is actually something that disappoints me about Apple when they released their iBook store. They had a few high-profile deals with a few different publishers, I think Penguin in the UK, to produce really interactive books. But instead, 99% of ebooks are basically PDFs, which is fine for a lot of uses, but it's not really pushing the medium. I mean, think about the different ways that we can use augmented reality to make books live, pop, and dream. I think that's a huge field for discovery that we're just behind the street on. Stranger Nightfire mentions having profiles from real life. Absolutely. Imagine walking into a party and being able to grab digital content about the different people that are there. Yeah, there's a creepy side to this. And there's also the introvert side to it where you can learn without talking to people. But that could really change how we work. All right, I think we've gotten everyone's comments. Oh, I'm sorry, Earth Emerald. Earth Emerald asks, what about going deeper into self? Identifying feelings from within. It's hard to do when you're stimulated all the time. Close your eyes, check inside. How to feel, understand your own inner reality. How to use both. Earth, I'm going to get to that in just a few minutes. I'm going to talk about storytelling. Let me know if that answers your question. If it doesn't, please jump back in. I want to hear from you. All right. One more from Golden Greymoon. How might these virtual interactions be policed? There have been lawsuits on behalf of avatars. There seems to be some distancing of responsibility and behavior. This has been a classic question since the Mud and Moo days, and it's really coming up now with a lot of the discussion around Facebook and Twitter accounts and troll armies and abuse, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. There are a lot of ways it can be policed. We've seen this in multiplayer gaming with the creation of player versus player worlds versus exploration worlds. So segmentation is one way. It's possible there would be lawsuits. It's possible that we'll see more content creation, or I'm sorry, content regulation. So Disney's virtual world for a while had a continuous check on whatever people typed. If you didn't type words that were an approved whitelist, you'd be grayed out. There are a lot of ways this can be done. The big fight now is to have some of the larger companies, again, like Twitter, Google, or Facebook, actually police the content themselves. And I think that brings us up to speed. I really appreciate this, friends. That's a lot of great stuff. This is a good discussion. Well, let's see. Oh, thank you, Letty, about Padlet, where it can censor. That's a good pun. It can censor bad words. Absolutely. Mal has one quick question. I think it's Mal the Kitty. Do you feel that walled gardens approaches of much commerce these days is stifling the concept of interoperability here? Absolutely. We're talking about different trends. One of them is the rise of verticals. So, you have hardware, software, networks all lined up for Amazon, for Apple, for Microsoft, for Google. And they really want you to stay that way. And unfortunately, the virtual reality world, the mixed reality world, the augmented reality world is incredibly non-interoperable at this stage. Again, think about the early days of the web when people kept trying to carve out different pieces of it for themselves, or you would have sites that would only play with a certain plugin. That's where we are in many ways right now. Zinnia asks about high-speed access for digital storytelling. The digital divide is one of the biggest problems that we're facing right now. It's one of the least addressed. Basically, in the United States, we have a major, major gap. It's driven in part by education. The biggest driver of the gap is between urban and rural areas. The FCC, to put it charitably, is not interested in remedying this gap in a productive way. And that's become a major problem. And people have been trying to move around it in different ways. So you have offline storytelling. You have people moving to different sites. But it's a major, major problem. I live in a very rural area, and it's a continuous problem. Buffy, I was just speaking of the U.S. because I was mentioning specific policies like the FCC. This is actually a problem worldwide. I've seen this north of Toronto in Canada. I've seen this in, excuse me, I've seen this in Australia. I've seen this in Scandinavia. The U.S. is especially bad at it, in part because we're a very large nation, and in part because of the setup of our telecommunications. There's a whole bunch of people who are chiming in. Carolyn is mentioning this, Stranger. Buffy, absolutely agreed. Buffy, by the way, I'm a big Canada fan. My wife is Canadian, and so I'm always happy to talk about Canada. That makes like one of, three of us in the United States. So let me move on. We've been talking about a few trends, and you guys are definitely plugged into them all, which is great. We're talking about VR, AR, automation. But now I want to shift to a different trend set. And this is the question of multiple inequalities that have deepened in recent years. At the same time, massive social disruptions loom large. Now, I don't need to remind us of rising tensions over race, gender, economics, immigration, nationalism versus globalization, urban versus rural populations, and how these tensions have expressed themselves in political surprises worldwide, like Brexit in the UK, Trump's election in the United States, or the continental European rights resurgence from Finland to Austria to Poland and Hungary. All of these have come together in the world of education in multiple, often dangerous ways. In the US, for example, we're experiencing rising political tension on campuses in various forms, be they student activism against racism or gender inequality, to having media intrusions into campuses, creating media firestorms, to having troll armies attack individual professors for things they may or may not have said on YouTube or on Twitter. We're also experiencing a perfect storm of pressure on colleges and universities as enrollment continues to drop, public support for higher education declines, and financial stresses lead to adjunctification, to program closures, to institutional mergers or terminations. Now, what does all this have to do with Second Life? What does it have to do with you? Well, you may have noticed a rising tide of anxiety about digital media over the past several years. From fake news to the latest Facebook fumble to trolling, we're increasingly worried about the digital world and how it shapes our lives. And one response to that anxiety is to rethink digital literacy. Now, just a quick show of hands, if you could. How many of you have used this phrase, digital literacy, or experienced it lately? Okay, this is a fantastic audience. Hooray! Well, I'll just skip that next part of my talk. No, let me just give a little bit of background and where I'm going with this and why I'm raising it now. It's an emerging field with many, many different definitions. I like to think of digital literacy as a strategy for helping individuals participate in the digital world with greater safety, with positive experiences, and self-actualization. Now, a key thing is that digital literacy is the latest twist in a series of literacy. So back in the 60s and 70s, we had media literacy, a whole movement aimed at teaching people how to interact with then broadcast media, how to interact with radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, and movies above all. And that was very, very powerful. It's still an active movement today. Then in the 1980s, we had the birth of information literacy. This came out of the library world with a very advanced way. Librarians, typically ahead of the rest of us, realized that they would have to teach people how to find, assess, and make use of digital information online. It was in the 80s. This is before the web was even born, which is pretty amazing. And librarians were able to do this and have been doing this ever since. In fact, there's a fantastic information literacy framework which you can find. Well, digital literacy combines these two and then builds on it. It adds new digital layers, including new technologies, but also the ways that we can socially participate. So unlike media literacy, which is usually about consumption, or information literacy, about using the technology or using information, then producing something, not necessarily socially, digital literacy has to engage with social media. It also includes the ways that we make creative work. Now, in virtual worlds, we've had to develop ways of sharing and sifting information since the very beginning. We've created not only spaces and characters, but stories, legends, updates, and tips. We've developed practices and folkways. It's not accidental that librarians played a key role in Second Life for years. I think you could help the rest of the world in its different worlds better deal with digital information. What you've learned about copyright, about brands, about trolling, about abuse, about lawsuits is rich and practical and should be widely appreciated. I think we had a question here. There's a question from Kavan Zinovka. What about what librarians are currently doing with meta-literacy? Well, this is one of the many regions, Kavan, where you can find librarians being way ahead of the rest of us, really trying to help us understand different ways of using multiple platforms. Edith asks, why not wipe out half the nomenclature and just focus on building literate citizenry? Edith, the question I'd have for you is, what do you mean by literate? I'm not trying to be tendentious. What I mean is that we have, in the United States at least, we have literacy rates in the upper 90s. I think you mean something, do you mean in terms of civic responsibility and awareness, or do you mean in terms of scientific literacy? Comprehending the world, I agree absolutely. And being able to communicate, yes, this is tremendous stuff. People sometimes think about that in terms of literacy and sometimes not. You'll find a lot of definitions of digital literacy include communication. And of course, they mean digital communications. So, how to teach people how to communicate through Twitter or through blogging, through Facebook, through email, and so on. And the different ways of doing that. I mean, there's on the one hand the technical details, but also the practical ones. When do you respond? How do you respond to abuse? How often should you respond? How do you get addicted? All these kinds of things. So I think that's a great idea. The general idea of being open to the world, I think that's part of what educators do and have always done. I think that's one of the delights of education. Beth Ghostraven has a question about exhibits at the conference. Don't know about that, Beth. Love to hear more about it. But let me plunge on a bit further, because I want to get back to what Earth was talking about before. See, as part of digital literacy, you're also experts in digital storytelling. I see digital storytelling as a key component to digital literacy. You see, the act of creating a story involves, among other things, absorbing, processing, remixing, and responding to information of various types. Pedagogically, creating a story is often a powerful cognitive practice, instilling learning while developing the student's voice. Learning how to make, rather than just consume stories, also teaches us about media ecologies. It helps us more critically approach media and maybe reform it a little bit. Now, I see virtual worlds and you residents as digital literacy experts because you're the gurus of making, not of passive consumption. For years, you've honed skills in how to create, share, and appreciate content of all kinds. You can reach out of world to help people create better in video, in social media, 3D printing, and gaming, and in life. You're also, I think of you as apostles of sheer creativity. Second Life has always been a brew of fermenting ideas as people sought to express their imaginations together. You can teach everyone else to dig deep for visions and to share them boldly. Now, you're also practitioners of storytelling, and in two ways. And let me just use this to kind of wrap things up and to provoke you a little bit more. First, Second Life has been a space of performance. People perform narratives in different ways. They could be musical stories or operas. They could be mysteries. And we've been telling stories here for a while. Second, you've also established places to explore, which in turn support the creation of narratives. Residents work their way through sims of all kinds, building up exploration tales while also experiencing personal changes to some extent, which readers have long known as character development. These spaces for story are powerful, underappreciated, and mysterious. Finally, let me praise mystery. This is, for me, the acme, the secret of storytelling. It might sound perverse, but too much clarity can kill a tale. What instead draws in the reader, the listener, the player, the viewer, is a lack of clarity. It's the shadow, the silence, the gap, the corner around which lurks a monster or true love, if only the narrator will let us see. Mystery is what keeps us at the storyteller's feet. Second Life has often created shadowy spaces and mysterious character. Perhaps it's been too mysterious at times. Let that pass. Virtual worlds have excelled at offering welcomes alongside the glimmering of possibility. They give us spaces to inhabit along with strangeness to dive into. That gift of mystery is the kernel of story, and virtual worlds can tell that story for years to come. Now, let me ask, what do you think of this charge I make between virtual worlds and digital literacy? Do you see yourselves as working with digital literacy? Do you see yourselves as being able to apply lessons of digital literacy in world and out of world? Or is that too far a stretch? Olive Tree Lighthouse has a great observation from another person. Enrique, watching on the stream, is commenting, AI is becoming more empathetic and involved, and how might they help in education? This is a huge question, Enrique, and let me just very, very briefly mention a few ways. One is directly the idea of AI helping us learn. My favorite example, if you want to get a handle on this, is to download the free language learning app called Duolingo, which uses some basic AI to help teach you a foreign language. I've been using it in two different languages. One I know sort of well, Russian, and one I don't know at all, Spanish, which I've been learning. And we can imagine more and more examples of AI helping teach people, at least at the basic level, some objectively verifiable content. So you think about the sciences, for example. A second way that we have to think about is, remember, go back a few minutes when I was talking about the different ways that automation could impact society. Well, if we have underemployment as a result of AI and automation, then education has to change. Do we become fiercer in teaching students how to compete for a shrinking marketplace? Or do we have to teach them for downtime? Do we provide entertainment and reflection? Now, in other ways, if AI leads to us becoming, as I was kind of half seriously saying, cyborgs, that is, if everybody at work has to work closely with technology, much more closely than now, then in education we have to shift so that we can better support that. So think about, say, someone working in government who's always going to be running mapping software, data analysis software, and intelligent agent doing searches. We have to teach people how to do that. And that's awful lot of work. Now, the other is, if we respond like we historically have done to automation by creating new jobs and new careers. So think back, for example, that when we invented refrigeration, that clobbered the ice industry, but we had the refrigeration industry, new jobs for that. Well, let's say we have new jobs. Then education has to grapple with those jobs and better prepare learners to enter those worlds. And on top of this is the biggest, deepest challenge. As AI and automation in general exceeds human skills in certain functions, I think academics have to help us rethink what it means to be human, what it means to live in a world where our creations exceed us. That's a deep, deep issue, and that's something that all disciplines can help with: psychology, philosophy, religion, sociology, computer science, and so on. That's a great question, and Enrique, that's just the first step of an answer. Let's say we've had a few more. We've had some chuckles and some notes. Atlanta High Mist agrees that digital literacy applies in world. Excellent. Zinnia finds that we are like silly putty. I'm not sure what to make of that, but I'll just go with it. Edith points out a really, really good point. We got into here, she writes. We must be digitally literate to some extent. Absolutely. A key part of digital literacy is the technical skills. And as you can see, I've managed to do so-so today. I fumbled the slides. You've only seen 2. But I've managed to make the multiple media sides work. And you can see my giant, clumsy, not very attractive avatar is nonetheless walking around and doing stuff. So we have to teach people how to basically use the technology. And again, a shout out back to Olive Tree Lighthouse and to iSky Silverweb for doing their best to help me out. So that's a key part as well. Now, Kavan Zanovka mentions with Pokemon Go, we talked about literacy where students can walk and use AR without running into things. Yeah, that's a real problem. The stories of people who would walk across a busy intersection to get a Pokemon, people who would find a Pokestop at a bad place or an inappropriate place. Yeah, we have to really think about this and how AR can be applied in a productive way. And I think your experience here as residents within Second Life really plays a role. I mean, just now when I'm here on the stage getting ready, I kept stepping and bumping into people. Okay, that's me being clumsy. But that leads us to think about how we interact with AR. And we have more questions and more comments. Karina Gonzalez teaches digital literacy. Fantastic. Where do you do that, Karina? With what level? And she also mentions that teaching people to enter virtual worlds is too much. Yeah, that really has been. That was my experience as well 10 years ago. It may be that part of digital literacy is learning what technologies are most appropriate for which people. Excuse me. And I think we had a couple more questions. Buffy brings up the idea of generational succession, that virtual worlds might be easier for next generations. It may or may not be true. You could see it with a greater fluency. It depends in part if they apply that fluency to this world. They're deeply immersed in gaming. It's a question to make that transition to virtual worlds. Lori Von Lustra, what language are you learning in Duolingo? Oh, Klingon. That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, Cindy mentions the possibility that I didn't have a chance to go into, which is that AI could destroy us. There is a wonderful fellow at Oxford who has my favorite job in the universe, Cindy. His name is Nick Bostrom, and his job is to examine existential threats to the human race. So he spends his time worrying about meteor, asteroid, comet strikes. He worries about disease, plague, nuclear war, and he also worries about AI destroying us. He has a good book on this, working at different ways. There are a lot of ways this could play out. There's the malicious Skynet idea from Terminator, right? But there's also the idea of AI making mistakes. One way of putting this is called the paperclip maximization problem. As you build an AI, and you assign it the job of making paperclips. You give it some robots to help make paperclips. So it goes to some steel, sorts it out, bends it, paperclips, and it keeps doing this. Then it goes across your room to your printer and turns it into paperclips. And it goes over to your TV, it turns it into paperclips. Turns your car into paperclips. And then more robots will make more paperclips and so on. There are a lot of ways, and we're thinking about this now. Mark. Zinnia gets poetic, but mentioning that we stretch and retain what we impress upon. Quite true. Golden Gray Moon is level 40 in Pokemon Go. I am somewhat in awe at this point. Karina Gonzalez says that disagrees with Buffy that Generation Z is adept at mobile devices but not computers. And I've seen many cases of this. In fact, Karina, I was talking to some people who teach students, 18-year-olds in the Boston area, and they mentioned that their students had never used Microsoft Office. They basically had never used a desktop or a laptop. They'd only used cell phones. They typed, but just not in that area. Portuguese, fantastic. Please enjoy the Lusophonic world. Well, there seems to be some connection then. So maybe I'm not completely off in trying to connect digital literacy with virtual worlds. As Cindy Bolero also mentions, more and more adults are giving up laptops for mobile. Hard to get virtual worlds to them. The one I wonder about for that, Cindy, is audio, because audio book usage is growing. Podcasts have finally gone mainstream. Some adults remember radio as a good thing. I wonder about augmented reality for virtual worlds. There's a fun exercise game called Zombies Run. I don't know if you've seen this. You put on your headphones, and you're immersed in a virtual world of a zombie apocalypse. You're being chased by zombies. And the game gives you running assignments based on your skill. So it'll say, all right, you need to get to base alpha. You need to run half a mile. Go. You start running, and behind you, you hear as zombies come closer. If you slow down, they get louder, so you have to run. So they get softer, and so on. So you'll see people running around town pursued by imaginary zombies, which does sound hilarious, but it is a good prompt. It's storytelling, and it does create a kind of virtual world that way. It's something to think about. Now, let me ask one final question to wrap this up. Where do you see virtual worlds and storytelling connecting in the future? Not now, not in the past, but where do you see this possibly unfolding? Do you imagine virtual worlds as test beds for stories to be? Do you imagine people using the combination of mixed reality and virtual worlds to partake of stories and create stories? Where do you imagine that going? Now, iSky Silverweb says, peering at tiny screens full of tiny images just does not grab me. I am a visual being and need to see it in 3D. So maybe for you, the lenses, the glasses, or the headset might be best. High-end machinima, definitely, Cindy. That's just it's remarkable how that's such a part of our world now. People just make stuff using games like this for machinima. Oh, Joey, do you have a link to Oculus Studio? If you could share that, please. I want to make sure everyone can hear this. Now, Earth Emerald. See, Earth, have we gotten back to your point? I hope we have. To develop empathy. I mean, when I've given people VR helmets, it's interesting. If you see them standing with a VR helmet or headset, and they turn and they see a person, they back away. Not from fear, because they've been too close. They really feel that connection. And I think with the power of sound, we might be able to see more and more. So it may be that it's an empathy tool. Maybe so. Oh, Joey, thank you so much for sharing that. You distracted me by thinking of the great creepy movie Oculus, which I strongly recommend if you haven't seen it. So many questions. Mal points out it can bring extended interaction and choice. Again, yes, like branching narratives all the way back to hypertext and choose your own adventure to gaming. Yes. Or the quest system. Thank you, Cindy. Good choice. Good call. Buffy mentions actors working from home, live performances, movie theaters being a group experience and taking part in the story. Yeah, I mean, all kinds of ways that can play out. You see this with some podcast recordings where you'll have multiple actors from around the world synthesized into one script and recording. Joey Obama mentions it's a different way of storytelling. Say more, say more. Olive Tree goes back to Enrique in the stream. Hello, Enrique. So the new digital brain interface devices that allow us to think changes to digital games and programs. Yes, cranial stimulation is a fantastic thing. If you haven't seen this yet, there's a great book by Kelly and Zach Wiener-Smith called Soonish. It's about emerging technologies, and one chapter is about brain-computer interfaces. And that's a really, really challenging thing. It's the progress that has been slow, but we're making some really, really interesting steps forward, making them less intrusive and more effective. So that really could be something amazing. I mean, imagine being able to capture thought or take dreams directly to a screen or a speaker. Oh, good point, Joey. Joey mentions, for example, people getting motion sickness in VR. So we have to shift things to make that not happen as much. Good point. Good point. Mal mentions extra-dimensional use. Say more about that when you can. And iSky Silver mentions Bryn O's art installations, telling stories in interactive spaces. Yeah, I mean, there's so many nice ways of doing that with a physical space to explore. We've been doing this with augmented reality to a degree, where people can move through a space and pull down different bits of story, different media, depending on where they're standing, which is really, really powerful. Museums are really expert in this in many ways.
Thank you all. I must interrupt because we're running low on time. Bryan, that was excellent. Thank you so much. Such an interactive session. And thank you to the audience for supplying some wonderful comments, which made the session even more powerful. Please show Bryan your appreciation. Thank you so much, Bryan, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your conversation, your thoughts, and your attention. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back in Second Life.